personal views and opinions expressed by our podcast guests are their own and are not legal advice or official statements by their organizations. Hello, my name is Debbie Reynolds. They call me the Data Diva. This is the Data Diva Talks Privacy podcast, where we discuss data privacy issues with industry leaders around the world with information that businesses need to know now. I have a special guest in the show all the way from the Beltway, kind of, New Jersey and DC, Brandon Pugh. He is a senior fellow and counsel at R Street Institute. Welcome.
Well, Debbie, it's a pleasure to be here. I've listened to numerous of your shows. It's always great to be on and talk about something that's a passion of mine, data privacy and data security, especially legislation.
Yeah. Well, you have a very interesting background. You obviously have the legislative chops. That's something that you work very closely on. You obviously are interested and have expertise in cybersecurity and privacy. So tell me sort of your trajectory in your career and why privacy is of interest for you.
Yeah, so thanks, Debbie. So my background's kind of atypical for DC. I actually come most recently from a state legislature, that being New Jersey. And in that capacity, even though most of the laws, whether it be judiciary or medical laws, they would funnel through me as one of the staffers and one of only a few attorneys, I pulled out all the data privacy, tech, and cyber legislation just because it was my passion. So it was neat to be able to focus on, yes, just New Jersey, but also really be mindful of the entire landscape across the country as New Jersey was considering legislation. So that's really where my passion for privacy specifically started. And then being at R Street now, I serve on it's a nonpartisan think tank, and I'm on the cyber team. But a major element of our team is data privacy, and I'm the senior fellow leading that work, which connects to a few of my past jobs even before the legislature. My career spans the military, time with the FBI, and time in several elected offices too. And ultimately, like, some people look at my resume and they're like, well, how does being an elected official match up with think tank service? And truthfully, I think it's all these experiences have made me a better fellow now, because DC is such a unique place. You have to have substantive expertise, but it's also very political, and you have to know the legislative landscape.
I think that's 1,000% true. I lived in DC for 10 years, so I know a lot about kind of the inside scoop of the Beltway and getting connected into those circles and understanding how things work. We definitely have an American audience, but we have a lot of people internationally, and I think a lot of people internationally are looking around at all the data privacy regulations that are being passed, and they're like, what is up with the US? Like, why can't we get this done? So can you talk about just about that? Like, how, people think it's so funny. So this is a funny story. So I was at like a ad tech conference, and I heard a guy say, well, why can't the US just take the GDPR and implement it in the US? And I'm like, oh my goodness. It's like, oh God. It's like so many things wrong with that statement that we have to talk about, right? Because I mean, structurally, obviously we're different countries. We're structurally very different. You can't kind of wipe out, 200 years of jurisprudence just because something is coming up. But talk about, someone like you who understands kind of legislation and how that works, and also the technical issues that we're running into around data. So tell me from your point of view, why is this so difficult for us in the US?
Yeah, and let me first say, you're right. I've heard the GDPR comments several times myself, saying, well, can we just enact that in the US and we'll move on? The reality is it's pretty complicated, as you alluded to, because, like, taking a step back to where we are now in the US, especially for non-US listeners, kind of two general directions. We see states acting on privacy legislation. Right now, we have 5 states with standalone privacy laws, and over 27 states tried to enact similar legislation this year. So that trend is continuing, and I think it's going to progress in the next year. And then we also see certain sectors regulated, like healthcare, finance, students, just to name a few. Um, the concern is really three of them, really. One is this patchwork that's emerging. So we have states are varying in their laws, or worse yet, you may live in a state with no protections, which is the vast majority of Americans. And then next, like there's national, our street strongly looks at the security reasons why we need privacy. And right now, there's major concerns from adversaries buying and selling information on Americans, and a privacy law would help with that. And then third, it's kind of a mess for industry. Not to downplay the need for it from a consumer point of view, because that's definitely very relevant. But industry now have a degree of uncertainty on what the laws they have to follow are. When is the next one going to come online? And I think Congress could really change a lot of this by enacting federal privacy legislation in the U.S. And we've made significant progress this year on that, but there still is definitely a long road ahead. Not to downplay how much work still needs to be done, but there is a potential there.
I feel like there just isn't enough education around what is that exactly is happening. And so to me, it's hard to make a change if people aren't on the same page about where we are right now, right? So I saw a letter that came out from I can't remember, some big industry group or something. They were like, tell the FTC to stop rulemaking so Congress can pass privacy law. It's like FTC, if Congress passes a law, it will trump what the FTC is doing in rulemaking. So to think that one is stopping the other is just not that's not true.
Yeah, and to your point there, like we recently submitted comments in the FTC, and I did raise some concerns around that in terms of their scope and maybe it being a little premature. But I think the solution to that is for Congress to act, because Congress could, like they've done in the American Data Privacy Protection Act, it's delineated different areas for the FTC to go forward and rulemaking on. Versus now, what we see, the FTC is taking it upon themselves to do rulemaking because Congress hasn't given them specific direction. So I think this is a real opportunity for those skeptical of federal agencies to direct them. And then, realizing that they are going to need resources too, whether it's the FTC or some new entity, which, hopefully it's not a new entity, but they are going to need additional resources, because I think there's a role for the FTC, but it should be, in my opinion, kind of constrained and directed by Congress, because after all, Congress sets policy, but the FTC are the substantive experts when it comes to privacy.
Yeah, I think we need a new agency, frankly, because the FTC doesn't cover all industries, right? So having more of a human rights approach in something, and not to say that the FTC isn't doing what they're supposed to do, right? They're constrained in what they can do, and so we can't pretend like those other issues aren't there. So I think having an agency like California did at their state level, right? Having an agency dedicated to this, not only like California is doing, but like almost any jurisdiction I can think of, China, Saudi Arabia, Europe, Australia, like all these places, Brazil, for Christ's sake, right? So all these places have decided that you need kind of an agency to work on this, the separate from other things. And so we know that a lot of the impetus behind privacy in the US has been commerce. So we can't ignore that, but I think there's more there in terms of kind of the human rights of people. So if I'm not in the US right now, if I'm not consuming stuff, like my rights don't really kick in, right? So that's kind of a big issue.
Yeah, and you've raised two great points just to kind of elaborate on. One being all those other countries that have moved forward on progress. We see ourselves as a leader in most aspects of the world, economically, military, but we're really behind now when it comes to privacy. We even see China have a privacy law. Granted, maybe it's not as robust in practice as it is on paper, but still they have something, whereas the US doesn't. So that's the first point. And second point, you're right. A vast majority of Americans right now don't have rights when it comes to privacy outside of like those limited areas like health and finance. If you live in 45 of the states without the laws, you don't have a right to know how your information is collected, how it's used, who it's sold with, and then most importantly, in my opinion, how it's protected, which is just kind of crazy that that's where we are now. Like we've come a long way. I am happy to go into it too. Like in terms of this Congress, a lot farther than previous Congresses. Um, and there's been a lot of areas that have been traditional roadblocks we've seen move forward on a bipartisan basis, which I think is the key. No matter how we move forward, we will need bipartisan support because privacy and even cybersecurity more broadly, it's a little naive to say this, but they should be bipartisan. Like these are issues that impact everybody regardless of their political party.
Yeah. It should be bipartisan. I think I don't know. It is and it isn't. Obviously it depends on, what pieces are on the chessboard at the time. Right. So all that plays into things. I know that, my when the ADPPA first, the draft kind of splashed on the scene. I think I was probably one of the only people kind of naysayers. Not that I didn't want it to, not that I didn't want federal privacy legislation to pass. I just felt like it was, knowing that the midterms were coming up, knowing kind of the state of play, like we were going right into the summer. I'm like, I just didn't think there were just enough legislative days to actually get it done. And so I think I was right on that. But there seems to be, and I had Cameron Carey from the Brookings Institute, who's a um, former head of the Department of Commerce, and he actually was the person in the Obama administration that had written the Privacy Bill of Rights. He thought that there may be some activity in the lame duck session, meaning now that the midterm is over, between the time that kind of new people get installed and there are new roles, there may be an opportunity for people, the Congress, to kind of regroup and try to figure out how to get ADPPA passed. What is your thought there?
Yeah, so I think there's two different ways this can go forward. Either we act on this legislation, ADPPA, or we're coming back in the 118th Congress and either reintroducing ADPPA or something similar to that. I definitely remain optimistic that we can continue to move forward in ADPPA this Congress. I do realize there are many priorities, though, at the same time, whether it be a spending bill, and there's so few days left. So I say all that to say is like I want to see it move forward, and I think that's the direction Congress should push for. And there is a potential for that. I'm just also being realistic that it is limited. But we have seen, even today, numerous key voices in Congress have said that they want to push privacy legislation during lame duck. So they are continuing to push leadership. I think there's still some big hurdles to make that a reality. I don't think they're impossible to overcome. I just think it's going to be a lot of work. But it was comforting to see key voices call for it to be acted on during lame duck. And really, just as it comes down to a matter of priorities for Congress in both houses and both parties. Is this the bill they want to prioritize? My answer is yes, because it's really needed now. We've waited long enough for privacy legislation. But if not, I think the 118th Congress should realize that ADPPA has come substantially a long way. So rather than like totally reinventing the legislation, I think that's a good starting point. And then maybe we think of are there ways to finesse it further in a new Congress? So I would say to Cam Carey's point, who I respect a lot, it's definitely a possibility. I think we have work to do, though.
Yeah. Cam is more optimistic than I am on this. Not that people don't want it, but again, there's kind of, logistics, right? There are technicalities. There are kind of a lot of movements happening in on the back end. And then we have holidays coming up, right? So it's like, are people gonna prioritize this over like 3 major holidays or whatever? But
you're right, and to add to this, and I don't want to sound pessimistic because I am in the camp that we need to continue pushing this, and I'm doing everything I can to keep pushing this. But there are some political challenges too, which we can't forget. I mean, Nancy Pelosi, Speaker Pelosi, has I wouldn't say she came out against it, but she came out saying that there was additional work that needed done, namely around preemption. And just for those that aren't attorneys or don't follow this, basically, how would a federal law interact with state laws? And the reality is California has their own law. So how would that interplay with a federal law that came on board? And that was her concern because that's come out with Governor Newsom, their state governor, their California protection agency. They all have concerns. So that makes sense why she has expressed concern. So the question will be now is, will she give this floor time and put it to a vote on the floor, given her concerns? And is there a way to address them? There's definitely a way to address them. The challenge with this bill is it's a very delicate balance because historically Republicans have been very supportive of preemption, meaning there's one strong federal law, and against a private right of action, meaning individuals can sue if their rights are violated. Democrats have been largely the opposite. And there's some exceptions. They want a strong private right of action, weak preemption. So all of these things they all fit together. It's easy to talk about them as discrete issues, but they're really not. So if we were to adjust preemption, let's say, then we may lose some Republicans that are against it because there's still this private right of action there. So that's kind of a political dynamic. And I think that's something that's remarkable about ADPPA is that it's tried to strike this balance of making both sides happy. Yes, there's still work that can be done, but they've tried. Secondly, like Senator Cantwell, it's not a surprise, but we've had 3 of the 4 key leaders on this bill, the chair and ranking member in the House, and then the ranking member in the Senate. They've all come out in favor of this. Senator Cantwell is the 4th voice that hasn't. And she's the chair of the Commerce Committee in the Senate, obviously. So she is a very important voice, and she cares deeply about privacy in her defense. But there are some differences between how she thinks this should look. And obviously her voice is necessary because she chairs the committee, and this bill still needs to pass in the Senate, which it hasn't.
So what are your thoughts about this? Now, I say this, and I know a lot of people, this is the reason why we can't get anything done, I feel, is because my thing is this. If we can agree on 80%, let's pass the 80%, and then let's work on the other 20 later. Because I feel like, to me, these types of big bills or things like that, they get done in layers, not layups, right? So no, don't wait to the end of the buzzer and then try to throw everything there. So to me, I feel like it would be better instead of having absolutely nothing, right? Why can't we say, okay, here are the things we absolutely agree on. Let's trim the bill, get those things out, and then we can fight later on these other little nuance issues. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, historically, that's similar to the view I've taken and our street's taken, because admittedly, this bill is not perfect in every sense. And there's certain parts that if I were to sit down and write it, it would look perhaps slightly different. But I do realize this is a consensus bill and that we need Democrats on board and we need Republicans on board. So we do need to find this middle ground. It's just not a small group sitting in a room. And I think that's why this is unique, because we do see left-leaning groups in favor of this bill and right-leaning groups. So in terms of the approach of passing it, I think there are certain areas that we could defer to a federal agency to do specifics on and give, like, let's say the FTC, for example. The challenge of is if we can't get consensus on these key areas like preemption and private right of action. Preemption, I would say, is still relevant, especially considering the speaker. And there's kind of 2 general ways we can solve it. Keep it what we have now, stronger preemption language, or we do what California is asking for, is make it a federal floor, meaning states can make stricter laws, but there's a baseline across the country.
Yeah.
So that's one option. But to your point, I think we could revisit other provisions later. Like one issue that's out there still is arbitration. So should we change arbitration, meaning that this is an oversimplification, but essentially should parties that have their rights violated have the opportunity to address it out of court, or should they be able to go directly in court? That's very simplified. But the concern there is that if we have a private right of action and companies are still using arbitration, will private right of action be fully available then? And there's pros and cons to that approach. I'd hate to see that hold up a federal privacy bill because of how far we've come. But I do see the arguments for and against it. My personal view is that right now we've handled arbitration in a piecemeal approach, so I would hate to see it kind of continue in that fashion. If Congress generally thinks the concept of arbitration is invalid, it may be better to look at a holistic approach rather than just saying, we're going to view it in this context today. Tomorrow, we'll look at it in privacy. Next week, we'll look at it in a different area, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Well, let's talk a bit about California. So, California has an advantage in many different ways. One is just time, right? They started, they've been very strong on privacy for decades. They have privacy as a fundamental human right in their constitution. They've done these little incremental steps, and that's the reason why they're so far ahead of everyone. But then also, the CCPA has been in effect for years now. The CPRA is going into effect. So I think, California, regardless of what happens on the federal level, in the absence of a federal bill, is the de facto standard in the US, right? And it will be for the next 2 years, regardless of what happens with ADPPA. So let's say if ADPPA magically passes today, it will still probably take years to implement it, right? So what I'm seeing, or what I have seen over years, is companies that were not in California, didn't have to comply with California's laws, decided as a business case it was better for them to align their business with CCPA. And what California was doing, because they felt that California would be stronger than these other states on stuff. And so that's been a very winning strategy for companies. So, in my view, making California a floor would be easier because companies are already accustomed to that, right? So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you're right. We do see many companies voluntarily following California or even GDPR, realizing that if in the future we follow a privacy regulation, we've taken a big step in the first place. And it also is a differentiator. I think something a lot of big companies and really small, medium-sized companies don't get enough credit for. A lot of them have voluntarily put naked in privacy as just a core business strategy. Yes, maybe it's not as strong as some would like to see, but I've been impressed just in speaking with companies and consumer groups as well of just what protections that are out there that are maybe not publicly shared as a common. But you are right that even if ADPPA passed today, there are provisions that would take time in areas that the FTC would have to do rulemaking on. So there would still be a path forward. And obviously, I always tell people my work really just begins. If ADPPA passes today, the implementation stage is going to be just as important. Companies then need help figuring out how to wrestle with this. The FTC is going to need experts to weigh in. So there is a path forward. But if we wait any longer, let's say we go in the 118th Congress and it just stalls, then we're just farther behind. I think California has done a lot. We've seen California's legislation impact where we are now with ADPPA. So I don't want to not give them credit. I do think that there is some thought that, and this is my personal opinion, I wrote an op-ed recently in the OC Registrar, so I maybe don't have a ton of friends there, but I basically was saying I respect California, but there may come a time where one state shouldn't hold up the entire country in passing a privacy law. I do think ADPPA has tried to account for California. Like there's parts in the text that specifically call out the CPPA, giving them authority that other states wouldn't have. There's also a lot of rights in ADPPA that are stronger or non-existent in California. The pushback there would be that California has a provision, essentially, this is oversimplification, but that the state law can always get stronger, but it can't take a step back. So some Californians have a control that or a concern rather, if we pass ADPPA today, could it get weaker in the future and Californians and Americans lose privacy protections? My response would be that in the interest of all of the country, because we are a country of 50 states, that's why we should have a federal standard. These very conversations we're having are the exact reason why we don't have privacy laws yet.
Yeah, right, exactly. I'm very good at predicting these things. I have been for decades. So my feeling is, I visited California recently. My feeling is they're not going to take one for the team. So I don't think they're not swooning on this argument like, hey, make these sacrifices for the rest of the states. They're like, nah, I think we're good.
I think you're right, and and I get it. California, when they came out with this process, like it was groundbreaking. Like, yes, our colleagues and friends in Europe were considering these things, but for the U.S., it was a big step. Um, I will be curious to see kind of, talking about politics a little, how things will play out. Yes, numbers are still up in the air a little bit, but it generally looks like the Republicans will have control in the House of Representatives. And obviously that means we'd have a Republican speaker. So I'm not sure on who that would be, but let's say if it was Kevin McCarthy as a speaker, in the past, he has felt strongly about a federal privacy law that has preemption included. Obviously, individuals can change their opinions, but that was at least his stance when he said that. So I will be curious to see if that impacts the future privacy legislation. Although the challenge could be is that if we have in the 118th Congress, assuming it doesn't pass this session, two houses, the Senate's being Democrat and the House being Republican, there are some people that are concerned about there potentially being an impasse and not moving forward. I hope that doesn't happen because this truly should be both parties working together. And even we saw that this year coming out of the House committee, a 53-2 vote. I mean, that is impressive any way we look at it.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent, excellent. Well, I want to switch up a bit. So you and I are sort of working tangentially on a issue around IoT, and I would love to chat about that a bit. So I was recently appointed one of 16 Americans to the IoT Advisory Board by the Department of Commerce. And so it's a 2-year appointment. I have to go to DC and meet a couple times a year, and we're going to work, this multidisciplinary team on cybersecurity, privacy issues, trying to work on the economic impact of IoT, figuring out what type of international agreements that make sense for the U.S. to try to push this. And one of the reasons why I decided to work on this issue is because IoT is buck wild, in my opinion, and we just need some direction, not only as a country but just internationally. So these products are coming out fast and furious. There just isn't a lot of guardrails there, not a lot of direction in terms of kind of security and privacy in those types of spaces. But I wanted you to talk a little bit about your work. I think you worked at, I want you to explain it, what you're working on with IoT, and we can chat about that.
Sure. Well, first, congratulations. I saw you were appointed to that, the way time goes, maybe a couple of weeks ago or so. Yeah. So I was thrilled to see, given your background in privacy, that you were on there, because traditionally we look at IoT devices just through like a cybersecurity lens. And as you and I both know, like there is a difference between privacy and security. Very intertwined, but there are differences. So my work around this has really been around what the White House has been doing. So the White House convened a group of mostly industry groups, but there was a couple think tanks there, myself being a think tank representative, consumer groups there, around really creating a label around IoT devices, or what they're calling the EnergyStar for cyber. So essentially, if you were to go buy an IoT device, let's say in the store or online, you could look for some sort of either QR code or a physical label that says this has been vetted. It meets a baseline level of security, and it allows consumers now to know the devices they're buying have met some baseline of security. Because to your point, you could buy an IoT connected device today, and you don't know if it's been made in an adversary country where they're intentionally collecting information on Americans, or is it so vulnerable to security that if you have an electronic lock on your front door, somebody could just open that and come into your house? We've seen the disastrous case studies of babies being monitored through baby monitors against, crazy individuals, for lack of a better word. So that the label initiative is underway. Still a ton of questions surrounding that, but I was, encouraged to see that process moving forward.
Yeah, yeah. I think this would be a fun debate for us to have. So I think kind of like the EnergyStar label is a good way forward. The concern that I have there is that IoT devices. So let me give you an example. So like, let's say you go and buy a non-technical toaster, right? So you buy a non-technical, non-internet connected toaster. It's not going to do anything except what it was developed to do, right? Gonna it's not gonna you don't need any software updates, you don't need any firmware updates. It's not gonna have like new features or anything, right? So a device like that, you put a label on it, it makes sense. Like a washer and dryer or whatever. But when you have an internet connected device, the manufacturer or the software holder, they can change the features that are happening on the device. The security can get changed, the firmware can get changed. So you have a device that can be changing and doing different things based on, what, the chips that are in the device, what it can, just because let's say for instance you buy an internet connected device, it says today it does 10 things, but really based on the hardware and the chips that are in the device, it may be able to do 20 things, right, in the future, because as more technology is developed, more software is developed, it can do different things. So my concern with the label is that a label, depending on what exactly is on that label, doesn't really speak to what that device actually is and what it can do.
Yeah, so I actually agree with you personally, because this is kind of a concern on how the label would look. So on one side, you could have, like, I'm just making this up. This isn't coming from the National Security Council, like a check mark that if you saw that, that means it's met the baseline. Another option is, or maybe a combination of both, is it's some sort of QR code that you could scan, and that would allow in real time for you to have the most accurate information. Because to your point, I could see a scenario where maybe it met a degree of security at the time of boxing it, but then a year later or even a day later, perhaps there's a vulnerability that is unpatched. And then now a consumer is buying a product with a false expectation of it being secure. So I think that is the value of having a QR code so you can get real-time information. Obviously, connected to that is consumer education. Consumers, it was not easy for EnergyStar to catch on. There's a lot of money and a lot of advertising went around that. So consumers would have to be told, what is the point of this? What is the information? And then on the government and industry side, there has to be consensus around what is the baseline and what information. So from my point of view, I want to see privacy provisions encompassed in this label. So far, it's mainly more on security provisions, but in the White House's defense, like, it's not set in stone, and they have a draft out there, and they've asked for critical feedback. So this is an ongoing process, not something that's done by any means. I've heard spring 2023 as a potential launch, but I'm not clear if that means that's the framework or if that's like when we actually see the first label itself. So kind of ongoing.
Well, I'd be interested. Anything a step forward. I'm not gonna throw salt on any efforts, because I think being able to realize that this is an issue, that education is necessary, I think it's definitely important. But I always think about those nuance issues, right? I'm thinking about someone's grandma who doesn't have a smartphone, or someone who doesn't fully understand. They don't understand that the device is changing, right? I say IoT device is like a computer without a screen, right? So you think it's doing things that you may not be aware of. So I think that education is really important. But not only that, I work with industry groups to work on standards and stuff like that. And I think, what they want is to drive adoption, but that adoption won't happen unless they have trust. So if that label is something that gives people more confidence and more, security, or, feeling that they understand what they're getting into, I think that's great.
Yeah, and you're right. There are efforts underway. Different entities out there, whether it be IOXT or some of their competitors, they have sample labels, as well as just different countries around the world. Like the US is actually not the one to have made this. They're just moving it forward now. So thinking of an approach that kind of respects the work that's been done and then syncs it with their international allies, I think is important. Because I think the worst case would be we just have another label that doesn't match up with existing work and efforts around the world. Then now we have a even more confusing system where consumers now see multiple labels, and they're like, well, what label is this? What does this mean? Or maybe in the future we see a label that emerges just for privacy, because we do see some vendors already that are providing privacy labels, let's say around websites. And I think that work is commendable. So rather than seeing that be put on hold for a future label, I think this is an opportune time for the NSC and NIST, because NIST is active in the space, to kind of think about how we can take a holistic approach with security and privacy for IoT devices.
Yeah. Excellent. Excellent. Very cool. Well, I'll keep my eye on you on that.
Of course. No, and likewise to your work. Yours is more fascinating than mine. You have the impressive position. I'm just somebody from a think tank that gets to follow and study these issues, which I can't diminish. I love it.
It's amazing. It's amazing. So if it were the world according to Brandon and we did everything that you said, what would be your wish for privacy anywhere in the world, whether it be legislation, technology, human activity? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so as you may have guessed, I'd like to see a federal privacy law in the U.S. And my personal feelings for that is I do think it should be preemptive. It should be one standard. And I think for that reason, I'm most concerned about the security side without it, seeing our adversaries collect information and use it. I still serve in the military, so it does concern me how we know. And this isn't speaking on behalf of the DoD, but it's just open source information shows nefarious actors around the world want information on military intelligence professionals and exploit it. I think that's just one of the many reasons for a privacy law. So my goal would really be to see Congress and the administration kind of rally behind having a privacy law. Obviously, the substance is key, and I don't want to see a bad privacy law move forward. But if we could get to the bottom of a substantively good law, I think that would benefit every Americans, consumers, industries, security. And I truthfully, I think it should be done now. I don't want to see a scenario where we're entering the 120th Congress, the 130th Congress, rehashing this. It's time for America to step up and join our allies around the world that have privacy as a priority.
Yeah, you said it. You said it best. That's amazing. Thank you.
You're too kind, Debbie.
Thank you so much. This was great. I think that everyone will fully understand, the types of challenges that we have here. And yeah, we'll see. We'll see. We'll see if your prediction comes true.
No, Debbie, thanks so much. I'm thrilled with your work, and I'm always happy to be a resource for you or any of your listeners that want to talk about these issues.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, we'll talk soon. Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you.